This essay is a look at America's betrayal of its British legacy and why this betrayal constitutes a moral and metaphysical failure. The West as a culture is one thing with a specific identity, and Britain was the flagship of the West. America was a colony of England, but rather than embracing what had made the West great, and furthering its British legacy, America disavowed its historic antecedents to build upon a new and distinctly darker foundation. Unfortunately, the example of the US has been persuasive, and to some degree, we are all American now. What we do here is demonstrate that this is not a good idea. We ought to have remained British. This goes for Britain as well. But the first order of business is to define failure. There are two ways to define failure. The first way to fail is to fall short of a mark. This kind of failure points to a standard one is expected to reach. This is a moral failure. But there is another kind of failure in which the mark may even be met, but one is still considered a failure. In this failure one disappoints not just those who had hopes of your success, but God Himself. This latter failure is a failure to become what one could have achieved had one understood we have a purpose. This failure is what can be considered a metaphysical failure. It is a distinctly spiritual failure. England has settled the colonies expecting the colonies to have a vested interest in supporting the motherland. But America had been settled by too many who were running from England's culture and laws. They had no great love for the motherland. When called upon to do their duty, the 13 colonies decided doing one's duty was a decidedly British notion that did not play out well in the colonies. But what was there to replace the notion of duty? There seemed to be only the idea of freedom, namely the freedom to abjure duty and set about satisfying one's own ambition. England was notable for the sense of duty an Englishman has to his nation. All men, great and small, felt a strong duty to play a role in England's greatness. Even the wealthiest young men joined the military or foreign service. England was a small island without a sizable population, and yet by a sheer sense of duty and even of mission, England ending up ruling a large portion of the planet and its population. England was a land where every man did his duty. This dedication created a church or a nation that came as close to being a church as has existed on this planet. Doing one's duty is a good substitute for the command to be charitable. If we seek to do out duty, we are less likely to be looking at what others are doing or not doing. Instead of looking to see what is in our best interest, we are looking at what has been assigned to us specifically and by implication, and seeing this is done. We sweep the sidewalk in front of our house regardless of whether or not the neighbors choose to sweep their portion. America felt far less obligation to the nation. It has become a collection of individuals each seeking their own best interests. The rationale for that is that their neighbor could not be trusted. Better, every man for himself. America reverted, or attempted to revert, back to the law of the jungle. The most charitable nation the world has seen is Britain. Why did the US abandon what had created the greatest empire ever seen? The US was populated by a lot of people who had a grievance against England. They were not predisposed to doing their duty by her, nor did they respond charitably to her royal dictates. America was a land of free persons, not just literally but figuratively, meaning free of obligations. The New Englander was free to work his land without the slightest concern for what some authority wanted him to do. The claim to freedom is well taken. But of course, we are not truly free of each other. The most doggedly free settler still retained a lifeline to Britain and the continent through a local supply store and the international mail. No one can be civilized to any degree and not retain connections with the rest of the world, regardless how tenuous. Few, if any, who have experienced the benefits of civilization, will forego these in the name of freedom, and if we wish to enjoy some of the fruits of community, we must contribute something to its upkeep. Freedom, as is the case with most terms that are important to us, has two faces. It is one thing to be free of compulsion and injustice, but it is another to seek freedom from all duty and obligation. There is no charity in this, and this is the prerequisite for civilization to prosper. The United States unleashed an economic juggernaut with its unfettered embrace of capitalism. This was matched with an unequaled antipathy towards communism. Yet capitalism, when done right, has a sense of charity to it. The true capitalist seeks to make goods and services people need at the lowest price point. This uncovers another layer of charity. In the British version, everyone does their duty, whatever is assigned to them. In the American version, the individual decides their duty. The British system worked well within the empire. Doing one's duty meant maintaining the empire. Once the empire was lost, what defined one's duty? To some extent England became lost because, without an empire, it had lost its purpose. But England was wrong in that charity is more than patronizing assistance and guidance. In this the US was right, we each need to stand on our own 2 feet. England became infested with parasites, including colonies that were far more of a liability than an asset. In its accent on self-reliance, the US realized we do not owe others anything. We have a duty to God but not to men. We help, but it is with a view to salvation, not narcissistic confirmation of a person's self-importance. We help despite a lack of credentials on the part of those helped. England got swamped by parasites, and it is getting worse. As it gets worse, the available charity begins to peter out. More claims are made than can be processed. This is the weak point of socialism. When charity is personal, it can be limited and targeted. When the state takes over the dispensation of charity, the charity becomes socialized and part of a social agenda. The aid is not given to help so much as to push the state's agenda, which is as much about trading beads and trinkets for power and property as about altering the prospect's future. America overcompensated to some extent by focusing on the fact that none of us are entitled to anything owned by another. With the free market they instituted something akin to the law of the jungle. In short, the power of the US was that it managed to largely protect itself from parasitic elements. However, it opened itself up to creating a situation in which extreme inequality was bound to happen. So long as it can attract a fresh supply of highly motivated individuals, the US will continue to thrive, but at a cost of increasing inequality. This inequality forces the state to step in at some point and subsidize a growing segment of the population. The inequality can only be permitted to go so far. America is a far, far larger economy than that of Britain's and has a correspondingly larger population, but it has not succeeded to the same proportionality. But we need to figure out on what axis did America fail, which it has been such a successful country in other respects. What hides the failure is treating America as a homogeneous entity. Averages are misleading when inequality is the most prevalent feature. If we assume the elimination of the 10 great evils is a sign of a perfect society, America fails miserably on all counts. But what is really missing from our analysis so far, and which helps to explain the inequality in the United States, is an understanding of what parasitism is. It is easy to see it in the life of a failure, in the beggars and criminal elements we encounter. It is harder to see it in the three-piece suits and chauffeured automobiles of those the world considers successes. In truth, parasitism has 2 distinct faces. There are the parasites who feed off the charitable disposition of people, the willingness of people to give, but there are also others that understand the system and exploit the system itself. Interestingly, the 2 kinds of parasitism reflect the 2 extremes we find in politics and economics. The left's parasitism is the more easily identified one. Here are the beggars, criminals, and social outcasts. But we also find politicians, social justice warriors, and others who live off of the public purse. A less well-known set of parasites feed off of the system in another way. They are often quite wealthy. It is not that entrepreneurs do not produce goods and services and create many thousands of jobs. One has to look, not only at what is being done but what could be done. We have to look not only at what the people in the company are doing, but what the owner is enjoying. The fact that there are 10,000 persons in a company working together to produce goods and services, does not mean that the owner is not a parasite. It is not the owner that is doing the actual work. The state protects private companies and their owners from those who would contest his right to the property he controls. But do millionaires have any more right to a corporation's property than the criminal to the products he stole? Where do we get the right of ownership from? It is not from the state. The state has no greater claim to the things of the earth than does the common criminal. By what right does the state give possession of the world to private entities? If we observe cases of ownership, there are two forms or ways of legitimizing ownership. The first is the law of the jungle. In this version of ownership, we own what we can claim and protect. This is the strong man version of ownership. It is based on power. This is the only form of ownership available to those who live in the flesh. But it is a form of ownership that is only available to the strong. The weak are dispossessed, though it is also true to say that those who are without property are weak. There is a positive reinforcing cycle at work. The ones with an advantage gain property, and those who have property gain the power they need to acquire more property. Those who are weak lose the property they have, and as a person loses property, they lose the power they need to protect what they have or the power they need to acquire more property. This is as simple as the power to acquire a mortgage. Without property or power, it is hard to acquire a mortgage. This is acerbated where there is no charity and where everyone lives or dies according to their ability to wield power. This lust for property and power leads to the formation of gangs and to the objectification of women. In one sense, the Americans threw the baby out with the bath water. They blocked parasites by doing away with any sense of charity. The U.S. with their frontier spirit threw out any sense of social obligation, at least any that was not returned in equal measure. The Americans created economic man where everything comes down to a transaction. Yet, charity persists in the U.S. where it always has, at the level of the individual and through the agency of the church. The U.S. failed because it failed to deal with parasitism and instead, in many ways, permitted parasitism to define the U.S. In their attempt to avoid parasites, they opened the door to them. The unfettered capitalist is not the independent entrepreneur they like to portray. Private enterprise is dependent on the state to protect private property. A capitalist invests capital, but this gives him the right to own what he did not create and has no legitimate claim to. Borrowing $1 million does not give you an infinite right to live off the proceeds. Gaining ownership of a factory does not give the owner the right to have authority over those who come to work in the factory. Private owners decry the parasitism of the public sector, but the private sector is as parasitic. There is a socialism of the poor, but there is also a socialism of the wealthy. The private sector does not pay its own way, and much of its power and influence is because of the state's support. The legal systems is created primarily to protect private property rights. Which is good, except that private property does not need protecting unless the state has usurped the power of private owners. By rights, we own only what we create, and no one has any right to anything they did not create. Only God has power over the assets of the universe because these were created by God. Even if you reject the authorship of God, you cannot claim authorship by man, so man's right of ownership is still denied. But this is precisely where the U.S. went wrong. England felt every man had a duty to what he had, to use it for the good of the empire. The British approach certainly was not perfect, but it was better than not feeling any duty at all, other than to oneself. It was better than what anyone else was doing. The American approach was an improvement on the British, only that it excluded the worst forms of parasitism. However, it has also made people more mercenary and less willing to invest anything before expecting a payout. The American system did create a huge flood of investment. This mimicked charity even whilst not being done for any charitable end. But selfishness goes only so far. It is a barricade to people who want things for nothing, but in the end, it is a temptation for the very same thing. It is only a short leap from working and giving nothing to not working and wanting everything. It is a good thing to stopping the exploitation of those who work, but that requires us to be charitable. If we both stop all freeloading and refuse all charity, in the end we will become far more concerned about not permitting anyone taking advantage of us than in contributing something to the world. What the U.S. did wrong was in prioritizing selfishness. Selfishness is a very short distance from parasitism. If we desire to end parasitism, we need something better than capitalism and something way, way better than socialism. We cannot end parasitism by allowing everyone to look out for number one. There is something greater than us, as individuals. We ought to be looking out for God.